Hello and welcome to the session on Are Your People and Organization Ready for Change? This is a follow-up session for Convergence, for those of you who couldn't make it in person and for those of you who attended and wanted a recap on some of the concepts that we covered. Our session is focused on macro concepts around how to help you do more in this space, regardless of the type of change that you're going through, whether it's a technical change, a culture change, a system and process combination change. It's really across various solutions and is focused on how do we enable your people and organization to be ready. I am personally very, very passionate about this topic because I firmly believe that this is what differentiates your ability to succeed, whether your program is large or small, you're in an enterprise corporation with many divisions, or a small company who's doing acquisitions. Truly, this differentiates your ability to be successful by focusing on how do we prepare our people. And the journey really begins with the end in mind. So throughout my career and my experience of helping large companies go through ERP implementations, CRM implementations, this is the area that people tend to do little, too late. And one of the things that we're going to share with you is how you're able to prepare your people and your organization to get the executive sponsorship that you need using some new concepts and models. So we're going to start by talking about the value of change. The fact that you're listening in on this session means that inherently you know that it's important, that there's some value, but most of you will need to go back to other stakeholders and talk about why addressing change management and putting budget and resources towards this area is important. You'll do a little bit of selling, so we'll help you to share some of those concepts. The second thing is we're going to align on what is change management. We're going to talk about some of the terms, the models that we use here at ENAVATE, and then we're going to talk about how to get you started, really focusing on not only some of the pitfalls, but the techniques for you to help prepare for change. And we'll use an example. Hopefully you can take a real-life example that you're working through now, and we can run through some of the planning pieces to help you get a jump start. So the value of change. We're going to talk about why it's important, why companies tend to have challenges in this area, and the benefits that you can realize. So I want you to think about a change that your organization has gone through. Think about one where you could visibly tell there was a change program in place. Think about how you knew that, right? Most of the time, people understood why the change was taking place, what was going to be different. You heard leaders communicating about the importance of making the transition. There was typically training and communication and ongoing activities that somebody was measuring, managing. Those are the characteristics of successful change journeys. And while technology is not new, ERP implementations and such have been going on for over 25, almost 30 years now. And we see that other areas of complex programs get better with time, the methodology, the techniques for data conversion, the testing rigor that goes into these things. The one area, regardless of the survey that you take or see, the data continues to tell us that we're not doing enough when it comes to preparing our people. And this is the biggest fail point that executives look back and say, I needed to do more. Whether you're looking at Gartner, CIO, or Forrester, typically they will say something like 5 of the top 10 reasons an organization failed with a transformational change is due to people-related issues. Sometimes those numbers can be as high as 90% of respondents on these surveys are saying they failed due to change management related issues. And so the point I make to you here is that if you don't have a plan in place and you're undergoing a major change program that involves people needing to use new technologies or new processes or new procedures or operate in a new culture and environment, that you ask yourself, is it worth rolling the dice to see if you can beat the odds? And I'll boldly ask you, why is it that you think that you can get different outcomes from the decades of executives who've done what you're trying to do before? And I share that with you because it truly is critical to think about what success looks like and how you're going to prepare your people for that success and the role that they play in it. When organizations invest in major programs, they want to get something out of it. They're defining key success factors. There's something they want to achieve, whether that's a certain ROI, whether they've defined success as the schedule doesn't have major schedule shift changes, it goes live by a certain date, that we stayed within a budget, they've retained key talent. Different companies will define success in different ways, but they're trying to achieve an overall result. You cannot truly be successful without addressing the human aspects of change. And in many cases, failing is not an option. There's many implications. If you're a large public company, there's analysts who will have a point of view around the dollars that are spent or the impacts to the business if change isn't implemented successfully. If you're reporting your program into a CFO and having to go back and ask for more money, or tell your executives that you've lost key people because the program's gone on for years and years, these are not fun conversations to have. They're painful conversations, and they can be mitigated and avoided by putting the right programs in place. We talked about successful projects that you've seen where change management was in place in some form or another. I want you to think about a real-life scenario where you were part of a program or a company that did not manage the change successfully. And I want you to think about what happened. How did people feel? What were some of the responses? What were some of the pitfalls? Where did things go wrong? I'll share with you some of these examples. A lot of times there wasn't a really good understanding of the organizational landscape. What is the current state? What is the culture? How much experience with change has the organization had? Are there too many changes going on in parallel where people can't cope? So having that basic landscape is very, very important around the audience, the organization, and the change. Oftentimes we see that companies don't have a true burning platform for change. And this can be a very big problem when you're in the thick of a program. Big decisions need to be made around how the processes are going to change, or which roles and responsibilities need to change, or performance metrics, or when you're asking people to really do something different. If there isn't a reason for change that the executives have a business case around and are rallied behind, often programs will be put on hold or shelved for good, and it's very important to understand what you're trying to achieve and have a burning platform from the onset. Another challenge can be not understanding what the future state vision needs to look like. And this relies on management having that vision of where they're trying to take the organization, how the change, whether that's culture, process, system, solution, etc., fits into that vision, and then tactically the program being able to demonstrate how the changes individuals are being asked to make map to that strategic vision. People need to understand the why and the how. Having the right levels of leadership engagement and sponsors in the divisions and the organizations at the more local level is extremely important. It's not enough to have an executive team who's committed, but have that mid-level of leadership and management out of the loop. Programs need to be put in place for both, and those are not one-time events. Those are activities that happen throughout the course of the initiative. A lot of times people think of change management as training or sending a communication. They look at it as an event versus something that's an ongoing process. And what we're going to show you later on is how there's a whole variety of different mechanisms and interventions and techniques that make up a change program, and that those are deployed consistently over time. And while training may happen as an event, it is not an isolated activity that means you've completed all the change management work and your people are ready. It means that it's one activity in a series of activities. Another challenge that I've seen over the years is when organizations believe that they can pull somebody from their communications department or their HR department, and those folks will act as the change management expert for the program. And while those people have great skills to contribute, they often don't have the bandwidth or the skill set around navigating the transformational change. Typically, those folks have been asked to be experts in compensation, to be experts in recruiting. They don't have, let's say, an ERP transformational change or a CRM transformational change background. And so you're asking people who have some knowledge to do something that's outside of their skill set and potentially bandwidth. A lot of organizations, as you know, don't have training departments. They outsource these things. So this is something to really take a look at and say, do we have the right skills, the right people, and the right availability? We're going to talk a little bit more about how we mitigate these risks and these pitfalls as we get into the model. And before we do that, I just want to wrap up this first section around the value of change and talk about the fact that this is something you want to do proactively. Having a change management program in advance means that you are in charge of the journey, you're navigating the journey. I've been called into companies where I've been asked to come do remediation work post-go live, and in the end it's very painful, it's very costly, and can be avoided if the program is structured proactively. Investing in people to manage the change journey, investing in your people to be able and willing to make that journey is what delivers your benefits. That's where you get the ability to increase your revenue and margin, drive growth, reduce risk and opportunity. It's the investment in your people. It's not the system solutions. It's not just the processes. It's your people being able to use those things that drive benefits. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the value of change. Now I want to take us through a discussion around what is change management. There's a lot of different terms. We're going to talk you through the ENAVATE model around the change management framework and give you a starting point so that you can start to communicate what you'd like to do in this space. So first, to align on terms. Some folks call this change management, some folks call it change adoption. At ENAVATE, we call it change enablement. And when we talk about change enablement, we talk about it as a formalized, ongoing program that's integrated into initiatives. So, for example, if you have a ERP program, whether that's GP or Navision or Dynamics or any other solution, you'll have functional leads, you'll have technical leads. You would also have a change enablement lead. This person would be focused on preparing both IT and the business because both are major stakeholders. Typically, when an organization has a system process type change, it requires different skills, behaviors, processes with IT, just as much as it requires new skills, processes within the business. We also look at this as an area where you're requiring people to operate differently in a new and changing state, and therefore you have this formalized program to help manage that with a work plan, with the lead, with a team to execute to that work. Okay, so there's two major concepts behind the idea of change enablement. The first that you've heard me talk about is creating a willingness to change. And what we're doing is starting with a group of people who may not even be aware that a change is coming, to the point where we tell them, here's what this initiative is, why we're doing it, who's leading the change in terms of executive sponsorship, why it's important for the organization, some basic awareness around when it's taking place. We then start to deliver communications and change enablement activities to start to build understanding through ownership. We start to look at how people will be affected by the change, what needs to be done differently. We start to engage them in providing feedback on the change and the solutions, engage them in some learning activities, to the point that when we're ready to launch or go live with an initiative, that they feel ownership and willingness to change. So that's one of the key concepts. The other thing to keep in mind with this model is that each of your stakeholder groups will go through this at a different pace with a different set of activities. So we'll need to bring our executive sponsors along this change curve before we can bring our super users, and we'll bring our super users along this change curve before we bring end users. So that's one important concept to think about as you're structuring the change management program. The second major concept, and the reason we go about this, is to reduce time to productivity. At the end of the day, we're asking people to do something different, so we need to build skills and capability. It is unrealistic to think that the first day or the first week of any major transition that you will have the same productivity levels that you had in the weeks and months prior. The reality is you're dealing with people who are being asked to do something different. In those first days and weeks, they are performing those activities in your production real life environment, and it means that they're going to be a little bit slower, a little more cautious. There's going to be more mistakes. So the whole point of the change program is to reduce the depth of that curve and dip in productivity, and to reduce the time, the amount of time it takes them to get them to perform at a normal state. And that way we accelerate the benefits that we're trying to achieve, and we do that through a variety of change interventions. One of the things to really think about around change enablement is that this is truly one of these areas that's both art and science. There are methodologies and deliverables and templates that we use to provide rigor and a path to get people from point A to point B. But there's also a bit of art with the science. And that's because we're dealing with people, we're dealing with fears and emotions, we're dealing with their ability to change. And that's where you're leveraging the experience of skilled practitioners to bring that art and science to bear. Because we're looking at trying to win both the hearts and minds of people, right, as we're building their capability and willingness. One of the concepts that I'll talk about in the change interventions is leveraging both qualitative and quantitative data. The science behind the program is that you do have a methodology to follow. We know what a good job looks like at certain points in time. And we use data to track, are we ready? How are we doing towards progressing towards readiness? And the data is both qualitative and quantitative, from feedback from users, surveys from users, that we could start to pull together and say 90% of users are aware of the change that's coming and who's sponsoring. So we try to get to a point where we can provide executives with hard data that helps them to see where the business is on track and where we need to make adjustments in our plans, where people haven't understood the information or having a hard time to buy into what we're trying to do. So let me go through with you the elements of the ENAVATE change enablement program and the framework that we use. The first is a series of activities around mapping out the journey and putting in place a program for us to be able to track the change adoption piece. So this is one of the key foundational steps. The second thing is putting in place a program around leadership and sponsorship and providing coaching for them across the levels of the organization, from top leadership down to division and line leadership. Then we look at setting up the change management network, which really becomes the super users and the change champions within various parts of the organization that are impacted and that will be brought along that change curve earlier than the end users. We put in place a communication program from the onset through sustaining and steady support stages. We look at process impacts and adoption and changes that need to take place. Typically, when you have programs that involve system changes and process changes, there's typically some job or role alignment that needs to be taken place, whether that's looking at performance measures or actually reassigning certain folks to different roles or creating new roles within an organization. This is a piece that we want to look at, may or may not be applicable based on the type of change you're going through. Providing a formal training and knowledge support program for both getting ready for the change and then ongoing knowledge. And then health measurements, looking at once you've launched an initiative or a program, how's the business's health, and measuring and comparing pre-launch data to post-launch business data. That could be anything from customer stats to inventory turns to employee satisfaction. It could be a whole number of different KPIs that your business typically measures and that we want to track and look in specific areas where we've made change. So all of these offerings within the framework are looked at in the cultural lens of the organization as well as the industry context. So for example, if you're in an industry where there's unions or very tight traceability or requirements or regulations, these are things that we need to look at in terms of the context of the industry you operate in, and some of these components may be more or less applicable. Another thing to understand about this framework is that your change may not require all of these components. Your change may only require some. And one of the things that we do is we assess the audience, the impacts, the type of change up front, is we try to get to how deep do we need to go into each of these components? What's the depth and the breadth that's required to successfully transition your organization? So we pick pieces of the model and we pick different levels of activities within this model. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about these elements of the change program. The journey map, this is truly the holistic plan. This looks at how we take the organization from the current state to the future state and what are the ROI business metrics we're trying to achieve. We take a look at how that ties to the need for people to change, and we start to look at the checkpoints over time where we'll assess through quantitative and qualitative data, are we tracking towards this change journey and meeting the milestones that we need to for readiness and adoption. The leadership and sponsorship coaching that I talked about can range from formalized forums and coaching to a wide range of leaders to very specialized hand-holding coaching to top leaders or leaders who are most affected by the change, giving them a change expert to really lean on and coach them through that journey and what they need to be communicating and doing with their organization. A lot of this depends on their experience with delivering and being responsible for driving change. The change network that I talked about, this is a really high-touch advanced readiness activity where there's forums for super users. They're given checklists, they're given tools, they're given communication messages. They're participating in a variety of activities so that they can be a local spokesperson within their groups. They can bring back feedback, questions. They're part of helping us assess readiness and even providing input to their executives to how ready they believe their organization is. Communications, one of the things to know is that communications truly needs to happen across a variety of mechanisms. We look at the various audiences and what are the right mechanisms to support effective communications. For example, warehouse workers typically have a different set of communication mechanisms that work best for them versus our finance folks. Looking at your industry, looking at the type of business and how communications are currently deployed is the starting point to then look at what information do people need, what's the best way to deliver that. A lot of times we see that businesses will say, well, we sent people a message. We've already talked about this before. Projects forget that when you're living in the project world, you are talking about the change and all this information on a daily basis, but that outside user group isn't receiving that same level of information. And so we need to be really cognizant and track what we're sending to which groups and making sure that they're receiving multiple messages across multiple channels so that they're receiving the information and really being able to understand, ask questions, and synthesize that information. Process adoption, this is an area to really look at based on system changes or policy changes within a transformation, how our process is being changed, and being able to incorporate this into some early adoption activities. The idea is that if you can make process changes in advance of your go-live date, you're minimizing the amount of change that people need to deal with and absorb all at once. This is a very effective mechanism, particularly for ERP and CRM implementations. Job role alignment, talked a little bit about this. One of the things to keep in mind is working very closely with HR and management on any roles or job functions that do need to change and any KPIs. Typically what we like to do is to work with them to identify what are those changes and make sure that communications are delivered to individuals in an effective form so that they can absorb those changes in the information to their role before they're in training, when they're trying to use a new system, process, solution, etc. Training and knowledge support. So the active training really becomes a process that we can start in programs and deploy a number of different mechanisms before a launch date. Knowledge capture and support is really around what is the ongoing information that people need to receive. For new hires, how are they going to receive that? We look at self-study in classroom, a bunch of different mechanisms, and there may be a combination of mechanisms that are used for an individual user audience. So this is an area that we assess what's in place, what can we create in the future, and really target the type of learning and skill mastery that needs to take place to the mechanism that's deployed. And then health metrics. This is an activity that's coordinated very tightly with management and leadership for divisions. We want to make sure that we're tracking, that we're making the productivity gains that we need to post go live, that we're minimizing business disruption, and that we are tracking this, measuring it, and being able to determine how our health is. Okay, so now we've talked a lot about the value of change management. You know a whole lot more about what is change enablement, change management. And now we're going to talk about how you successfully enable change. Where do you begin? So I want you to think about a change journey that you are involved in right now. And as we start to go through the discussion, I want you to really work through and think through the activity so that you can take this back into your organization and start to have conversations around what you need to do next and how you mobilize. First thing to do is to look at the business case. And based on the business case, one, make sure that there truly is a valid business case and be able to tie that then for the case for change. Once we know there's a strong reason the business needs to do this, we're going to get value out of it, we can start to say, okay, let's assess who's affected, what those needs might be, and at the macro level, how will things be different in the future. That gives us the baseline to then start to create the change program where we say, okay, based on the degree of change, based on our culture, our history of change, the audiences that are affected, what plans do we need to put in place? So we go back to that model and say, how much of this model do we need? What pieces of the model? And how deep do we go in the tasks that are required? Then we start to deliver that change program. And as we monitor and evaluate, we adjust those plans. We talked about the fact that we're dealing with people, and as we assess their readiness, their understanding, their levels of ownership, etc., that we're able to go into and adjust the plan, add different activities, maybe take certain activities out, so that we're constantly monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting as we're delivering that program. So that really does become iterative. So that's the macro level in terms of the approach you'll take. So let's talk about linking to the business case. I want you to think about your business strategy. Think about the changes in your marketplace, where your organization is trying to go. Think about, in the context of the change you're trying to implement, how big of an impact does it have on your culture going forward? Are we requiring culture change? How big of a change is required in terms of talent, skills, capabilities? Can you achieve the business strategy with the people and the talent you have today? When you look at the org structures that are in place, are there new org structures based on new business models that you're trying to get into because of the strategy? Is the technology that you have sufficient to support that business vision? And will processes need to change? As you think through this gives you a sense as to how dependent is the program and the business case on people having new behavior, on the organization operating differently. So for some, that might be very low impact. Maybe it's a very modest change. But for others, it might be high. And so I want you to just circle on the forms that you have and to mark mentally where you think this shift is. Are you making an extensive change, moderate change, and how important is it that the people in the organization operate differently to achieve the business case you're trying to achieve? The next thing I want you to do is to think about the landscape, your organization. Who is affected? What is affected? Where? Which locations? Think about the significance, the overall degree of change. Are you altering things slightly? Are you going in a new direction? Is this truly transformational? For different types of changes, it may be different. If your organization is doing an upgrade and you've done these 3 other times, this may not be a significant change for you. But if you're trying to implement a system for the first time or after 15, 20 years, it may be very significant for your organization. I want you to also then start to think about and recognize your organization's ability to change. Some of this will also go back to the industry you operate in. Most organizations will agree that we operate at a higher degree of speed and change on a constant basis in today's business environment. And so some organizations have gotten very, very good at dealing with change. And so it may be a very modest impact because they know, you know, that your organization is able to change and able to handle many changes simultaneously. Some organizations, while the macro environment operates at a very fast, rapid pace of change, the organization's processes, systems, people have all stayed pretty constant, and change has not been something that's had to be dealt with internally for a long time. So these are things to think about as you're planning for the type of help you might need in structuring a program and getting expertise in-house to help with this, as well as the speed in which your organization may be able to change. And that truly impacts potentially the timeline for when you're trying to deploy various initiatives. The other thing to think about is for organizations that have too much change. I've worked with companies where just as you have like an IT roadmap, you would have a cross-organizational initiative roadmap that looked at, for each stakeholder group, how many different change are they being affected with across new offerings, IT, business initiatives, HR initiatives, etc. And you could start to look at where there's too much activity taking place in certain quarters so that you can adjust timelines to accommodate for the number of events taking place and people's ability to absorb change. So a couple good things to think about as you're getting started. Some other things that you really want to think about are some of these influencing factors. And we've talked a little bit about these around having the burning platform, really having a clear vision of what success looks like, understanding project history. I've been on engagements where people, we've gotten through the project, first couple of phases, and then you start to hear, oh yeah, we've tried to do this 3 other times and it's failed. It's important to understand if a project has had starts and stops, the perception of those programs to address those throughout the change initiative. Looking at the speed of change, we've talked about that, the culture operating in, getting the leadership buy-in, truly that they are behind the vision, the goals, the objectives, the way it's being executed, and then they're involved along the way. One of the key concepts is you want your business leadership to be saying, my organization is ready. You want them to take ownership for readiness. It's not IT's job. It's not the individual change enablement lead's job. It's not a one-person thing. It's owned by the leaders within the organization. We're guiding and coaching and helping deploy activities. Often a scenario you get into is IT's running a program, the change journey hasn't been navigated, leaders were brought in at the beginning, they're not brought in along the way, and we get ready for a go live and they turn to IT and say, the project needs to be pushed, you haven't done X or Y and my people aren't ready. And that's not a situation you want to be in. And then we talked a little bit about competing change efforts and journeys. So all of these factors are things as we start to wrap up to really think about how are you addressing these. If you are, what are the risk mitigations that you can put in place as you build your change plan? Okay, one of the other important topics is our stakeholders. So I will tell you that not all stakeholders are created equally, and yet you will have all different kinds of stakeholders on whatever journey you're going through. You will have folks who are leaders and excited about the change. You will have people who are resistors and are very vocal about why the change shouldn't be implemented. And you'll have followers who are looking at both of the leaders and the resistors to kind of wait and see how it goes to form an opinion. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that, all of these folks have their own self-interest. There's a certain level of fear or skepticism or enthusiasm that you need to be aware of with the various stakeholders. And it requires a plan, right, that we track over time and measure and adjust to achieve results. And while you and your organization might be going through a very large journey, I take this example and I look at just on a very small level. When I have gone out to take my kids for a walk, my oldest son is my leader, and he starts off and he's so excited about going on a long walk. He wants to go outside the neighborhood, he wants to go up the mountain hill, and he wants to take the dog, right? So the leader is wonderful and supportive and exciting as that can be, also has some things that you may be aware of where they might want to stretch and challenge the program beyond the comfort zone of what the program's able to do. So, there's things to keep in mind that are positive and risk mitigation areas around our leaders. Then my middle son is a great example of a resistor. Before I've even gotten the dog's collar to walk him and gotten everybody's shoes on, he's already saying he doesn't want to go on the walk, it's too hot, he doesn't want to do it, and the resistance starts right away. And so what I do is I start to look at what are some things that I can build in it for him, the what's in it for him. How do I get him to look at this as exciting, interesting? Maybe we give him the opportunity to walk the dog along the way or to hold some of the snacks and provisions that we need to bring for the little one. Who is my follower? She is looking to her brothers to see, does she want to go on the walk? Is it going to be too hard for her? We often need to slow down for my youngest one. She needs to have some water. Sometimes we need to pick her up and hold her. Your followers will have similar patterns of behavior on a corporate level. They may need to see some of those leaders or even the resistors talk about why this is a good thing to go through or a good change. They may need a little extra time to absorb the information, and they may need some support along the way. So I share that story with you because, again, it's on a very small level. It's a very small task. You all have a long journey ahead with a lot of complexity, but complex or small or simple or large, we need to have a plan in place and do certain things to help bring those people along and those stakeholders so that we're winning their hearts and minds. One of the last steps, we've looked at the context for change, we've looked at the business case, we've looked at how your organization's culture, the history, all of that. Now you start to assess how much change programming is required. How much investment do I need to make? And while the dollars will be different, the percentages will be different based on the types of change you're going through, I ask that you start to think about your need. Is it a modest need? Is the data that you've started to create telling you that you need a high level of investment in change to achieve those objectives? So you want to start to think about that. And as we start to close, I'll ask that you really think about what you can do up front to invest proactively versus having to deal with the costs, the challenges, the frustration, to deal with those later. So setting yourself up for success, we've talked about a lot of these different components. This is just a quick recap for you to think about as you're taking the notes and going back into your organization and starting to set up your change program. Some of the key concepts. We've talked a lot about what to change. There's some things that you don't want to change. I think in most cases you'll see that all people need to feel some level of recognition for the work they're doing, for the investment they're making in their organization, personally and professionally. They want to feel like they can trust their leaders. They want to feel like they're productive and contributing to the organization. They want to feel like they're being dealt with respect, and they're looking for opportunities to grow. So as you're looking at all the things you might need to change, please keep in mind things that you don't want to change and that you're really fostering and tapping into as people are going through an initiative. So hopefully you found this session informative. You may have lots of questions. We're happy to continue that conversation. Feel free to contact me, and I wish you the best of luck in your journey ahead.